Ezri, and this is Josh. He's been working on sound designing for over 15 years. And right now we are going to start by talking about dynamic mixing. So my first question for you is, what is dynamic mixing?
So in video games, dynamic mixing usually refers to how we change what is most important, what is most focused on the sound from moment to moment in a game. So I'm sure you can imagine when you've played a game that as you're playing the game's constantly changing all the time,
Yes.
right? Exactly. So as the game's changing, as things are happening differently over time, you want to be able to like focus the sound, like what's the most important thing in the sound. So you're dynamically, so you've got like a high importance and a low importance. These things are dynamically changing over time based on what's happening in the game. So the game's saying, like, this thing over here is really important. And so we decide with all kinds of cool tools and like technology that we build how to turn that, information into something that can actually control how the game sounds in a way that puts like the most important thing for a player to hear at the top of that priority so that they know what to hear. What's the most important thing to hear? What should they be paying attention to?
Instead of just paying attention, like it's one thing is louder, like it's kind of like one thing's louder because say like someone in the background is maybe walking. You kind of want to pay attention to that, but you don't want to pay attention to your own footsteps because
That's
you
a good
don't
point,
want
yeah.
it to get it mixed up. You're like, oh my god,
Totally.
that person's footsteps. Someone's coming.
Totally.
I need to hide.
If
or
there's
whatever.
if there's an enemy around the corner, I want to hear that enemy's footsteps more than I want to hear my footsteps.
Because then
I
you
don't
could
care
get
about my
mixed up.
footsteps. Yeah, I want to know. Excuse me. I want to know the character that's coming in that I might have to like do something, right?
Or maybe you don't. It's just maybe a friend that's coming into the room.
But then on the other hand, if I'm by myself walking through a space, if I don't hear my footsteps, I might be like, well, where's my footsteps? What's going on here? This isn't.
And then it just takes you out of the experience.
But if I muted those when all kinds of explosions are happening, you wouldn't even notice that they were gone. But you'd hear that explosion more clearly.
But if you try to take the time and effort into putting footsteps in when there's a whole bunch of explosions happening, it is work spent on nothing.
Well,
and
it would be a distraction, and it would actually make it harder to hear the explosion because those sounds kind of come together in a way that kind of like it kind of like makes it harder to hear each other when there's more sounds playing at once.
Yeah, and then it just becomes and there's a whole bunch of noise, and you're like, what is happening? Stuff is happening, but I don't understand because there's a whole bunch of sounds overlapping, and when that happens, it does not help.
But when you hear 2 or 3 sounds, you can tell what those 2 or 3 sounds are. But when you hear 500 sounds, it's kind of hard to understand what all those different sounds are.
I have a second question. How does dynamic mixing affect the game?
Well, it's a pretty important part of how we hear games because, as we talked about a little bit before, it has an influence over what the player is paying attention to. Or, in fact, a different way to think about it is that it helps direct the player's attention to what's important. If we do it really well, we are telling the player what's most important to listen to. So if they're being attacked, they probably want to hear the sounds of the person or the character or the creature that's attacking them more than maybe.
A person talking?
Well, depends on what they're talking about.
Maybe they're just talking. They're just like in the background.
It depends, though, right? So sometimes it might be like, yeah, that's really important. Other times it might be the person talking might be like, hey, there's a big explosion. There's a grenade coming towards you. That might be important too, right? So it's about but someone that's just like, blah blah blah. I'm talking about my day. Like maybe that character's voice isn't important, but the one that's trying to tell you about maybe a grenade coming at you.
Kind of like another person talking to like 2 people talking to each other, and then like there are a whole bunch of explosions. You're like, I don't care about that person. No, not paying attention to you because there are explosions and people are trying to kill me.
Yeah. So the thing is our minds can only understand like 2 or 3 sounds at a time. So what we have to do as sound designers and mixers is try to come up with ways that we can always make the 2 or 3 sounds that are the most important at any moment always be really clear and like at the top of like this mix that we talked about, right? And by doing that, then if we do our job well, the player will always know what's the most important thing to pay attention to with their ears, whether it's because of the space they're in or because of just being immersed in the environment, or if there's like maybe like a bad guy coming toward them, or even a good guy that they're supposed to be paying attention to their, conversation or something like that.
Yeah, maybe
Like,
they're talking to you
yeah.
about like very valuable news, and maybe some really good hints in the game.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's just them talking like, oh. Sometimes it's just like, oh, my day has gone good because of blah 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 blah. You don't want to focus on that person because you're getting shooted at, or someone's trying to.
But when
kill
you're
you.
not being shot at, maybe that's the time to pay attention to those things, right? So when the game changes, we need to program the game to know when it's appropriate, for instance, for this character to be like, hey, maybe it's not important for this conversation now, but this other thing over here is really important. And so we assign values. We assign like basically numbers that say this one is more important than this one. And it might be differently important based on all kinds of different factors of like how far away they are, how close they are, how maybe if they're on my team or an enemy team or any kind of thing like that. So for instance, here's a good example. When an enemy is shooting at me, I want to hear that enemy sound, right? But if a friendly is shooting toward me, I don't care so much, because he's not going to hurt me. Because usually a lot of those games, like the bullets don't hurt your friends.
Sometimes it does.
But what I want to know is if like I want to know the things that my attention need to be focused on. So when we make the game, we try to make it to actually help the player know what is most important.
Okay. Now we are going to move on to space audio.
Okay.
My first question is, what is space audio?
So the idea of spatial audio, in a really basic way of describing it is that a sound should seem like it's coming from a very specific location around your head, around your perspective that you're hearing it, and it should sound like it's in the same space, or that it's in a space that's appropriate. So with a lot of like older ways that we used to make like 3D audio with games was when on headphones it would just sound like it's a little bit more to the left and a little bit more to the right. Was sort of how
I'm familiar with some of those games. Like
Yeah.
sometimes, let's say in it's more in Job Simulator than in Super Hot, because in Job Simulator you don't really. It's not a very like, oh my god, like adrenaline game. It's just a slow game. But like in Super Hot, you know where it's going.
So with spatial audio, what we want to do is not just be like, oh, it's a little bit more to your right, a little bit more to your left. We try to come up with ways to make it sound like it's like right here in space.
Or here.
Like that you can hear the difference between here and here and here and here. Like they're all different. And you can hear that and you can tell that it's actually coming from that spot. And we use this awesome technology that makes each sound come from like this space that actually works in headphones. It's really cool. And then there's other stuff that we do that not only makes it sound like it's coming from a specific point in space around you, above, below, behind, front, all that stuff, but also that you sound like you are in a room, in a space that seems realistic. Whether it's because, I don't know if you've noticed, you get close to a wall, it sounds different than when you're farther away from
the wall. There's
right?
like something.
You can hear those differences, right?
It's kind of like in a wall. You're like your face is bouncing against it, and without
your sound
a wall,
bounces off the wall when you're over here, and it sounds different than when you're over here and it's farther away. And we have technology that is used to make it sound like that, so that when you're in a game near closer to a wall or a ceiling or walls and shapes and objects of different kinds of materials that like bounce the sound off differently. Like some of them still might bounce the sound off, but like a carpet on a wall is going to have a different kind of a bouncing sound than like a glass window. A glass window is going to reflect a lot more of the sound, and a carpet on the wall is going to, like a curtain, for example, is going to absorb more of that sound, and it's going to sound It's going to sound quieter. It's going to sound softer. We use these certain terms that are like soft, bright, sharp, that kind of thing.
Kind of like, say like you drop a can on a carpet floor and it sounds like it's bouncing off a tile floor. That's just like you're like, what? Maybe it's important to the game because maybe there's something that you drop on the floor. Maybe there's something under there that you want to open the tile or whatever, and there's something important under there. And sometimes it's just like that, and you're just like, what? And it's confusing. How does space audio affect the game?
I think one of the cool things with spatial audio, especially when we're talking about VR games, is how natural it feels to be inside the space that we're creating in the game. There has been so many times where mine has just been like, oh my God, so blown. When I'm playing a game and I'm moving through the space and I can feel the difference of like being in a great big loud echoey room and then like walking into a smaller softer room that feels more like a bedroom or a closet and feeling that difference and change as I move through that space. It feels like I'm in that game so much more
Maybe
than I ever would if that wasn't there, if it was just always the same all the way through, because that's how it used to be. It would just be like, it would just sound exactly the same as you went from room to room to room, because we didn't have the tools and the technology to make the sound change based on the size of the space, the material that the space is made out of, and even just your perspective as a listener inside that space. We didn't have all those technologies like we do now.
Like, sometimes I get so in the game, and sometimes maybe there's a sound of a gust of wind, and I actually feel it. Like, my body's making me feel it. I'm like, ooh, and then it makes me maybe creeped out or excited or happy. And once I was in a game, and I got so into the game that I leaned over onto a counter, and I went down, and this is in Job Simulator, and I got so into the game, and I fell down, and I'm like, this is so cool. And I'm like, oh my God, there's actually real life happening right now. I thought that was, I was sad that it wasn't, Job Simulator wasn't like actual real life. Okay, so do you want to move on to the third question, or do you have anything else to say?
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. My third and final question is, how do you make it actually sound like you're inside the game and not just like having headphones and VR on?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different technologies that are involved in making this stuff like sound the way it does, and for it to be believable and feel natural and realistic. One of them is a little bit of like this technology I was describing before about like how making it sound like it's not just a little bit more to the right, a little bit more to the left, but like it sounds like it's all the way around you, and it has a lot to do with like filtering and little echoes that we apply to it to make it sound like it's in a space. And then there's also other cool stuff that we do where we could put up like what are called like reflectors. So like there's this really cool technology and a tool called Wise, Audio Kinetic Wise, where you can set up these really cool like volumes, these objects that reflect sound off of them. And when they reflect with a filter on them that says that their sound reflects because of this kind of material. So if I say the reflection is glass, the reflection is really bright, so it has a lot of the high frequencies still in it. But if I say the reflection's like a curtain, for example, it's gonna soften that. It's gonna sound less bright. It's gonna have less of the high frequencies. It's gonna be more muffled sounding.
Like,
exactly. It's gonna be more like this than like this. Totally.
Like like say someone's talking like, hello. Hello.
Exactly.
That kind of like is like it's muffled and you can't can't hear them as better as you would when they're like talking like this.
Exactly. And so each time so then we do this math to like bounce the sound around the room to kind of like come up with like a way that it sounds like that sound is in the room, and it has something to do with how far it is away from all of these walls and ceilings and stuff, and what those walls and ceilings are made of and how they bounce around. And then that can also make it feel even more realistic. It's amazing how natural And especially when we move through these spaces, we go from one room to the next, and we can slowly hear it change as we move through the space. It makes it so much more realistic and so much more believable than if we were just like, if everything just kind of stayed the same. That's kind of the key of dynamic mixing and spatial audio, is that it's constantly changing in the way that when we are in the real world, all the sounds around us are constantly changing because our heads are always moving just the tiniest bit or a lot, no matter what it
Like
is.
with my hair, it's like it's moving around. You can
Yeah.
hear that.
And it has effect on how you hear things, even. That's that ponytail around your ears. Totally has an effect on how you hear things.
Can I move on to my final question of
Sure.
both of them?
Okay.
What would it be like with no dynamic mixing and space audio?
Well, I think it's kind of, that's kind of two different questions, but they're both related. So on the subject of like the dynamic mixing part of it, if we didn't try to do that kind of dynamic mixing, it would be like you're hearing all the sounds all the time, and so it would be really difficult to make any sense of all these sounds. Like we wouldn't know what's
Like everybody overlapping and everybody talking at the same time, and you can only hear like you're trying to hear this one person that's actually doing valuable information, and but then everything around you is like
right. So you might not be able to like make any sense out of what you're hearing, or at least the thing that you're trying to pay attention to. And so the game is trying to help you pay attention to what's important, or at least in the best way that it can, right? And then in the spatial part of it, it's also about like making it feel like you're in the same space that you're in. So if it feels like you're inside of a a great big metal container, and yet you're hanging out in your living room, like that's not gonna feel right. And you're gonna be like, what's going on? This feels so wrong. Like why does it sound like this? It sounds so echoey like a metal container. And yet you're in the game, you're maybe just sitting in a regular living room or something, and that seems strange. That would take you right out of the game. You're like, "What? This isn't right. This doesn't make any sense." But then, if it's even more accurate, if it's even more like tuned to be the way it's supposed to be in that room, it's gonna feel even more like you're in that living room, even more so.
Hi, it's Ezri. I hope you had a good time listening. I hope you learned something about dynamic mixing and spatial audio. How did you think about it, BB-8? I agree.